True Crime Conversations acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast was recorded on. It's a Friday afternoon in the New Zealand city of Christchurch. Families are exchanging warm greetings at the Ao Nua Mosque while their children laugh and play in the foyer. Today, around 190 worshippers have gathered, preparing to kneel for Jumu'ah, the most sacred prayer of the Muslim week. The atmosphere is peaceful. It's serene. Few could have imagined just how quickly that peace would descend into unspeakable horror. Just outside, on the quiet suburban road, a man pulls into the driveway next to the mosque. He's alone, dressed in camouflage and a tactical vest with ammunition magazines strapped to his waist. He'd also attached a GoPro camera to his helmet, and from that, he would start streaming live on Facebook. "Hello, lads," he says. "Let's get this party started." You can see his hands on the wheel before he turns to the passenger seat. On it is sitting several guns. They're marked with white lettering. Now, these words wouldn't make much sense to those of us who can't read Cyrillic script, but for the families of people who'd survived a genocide in Europe decades before, it would be a shock. In the boot of the car, next to some plastic shopping bags and some red fuel cans, sits yet more guns. You see him reach for a Bluetooth speaker, pressing buttons to start playing a song. And the jaunty accordion music that then filters out through the car covers up the darkness of the lyrics. He'd already been listening to several songs on the drive-in, Serbia Strong, an anti-Muslim track, and the British Grenadiers, a traditional British military march. At exactly 1:39 p.m, he steps out of the car, heavily armed, and walks towards the mosque. He ignores the three people who walk past him on the street. They aren't his target. Instead, we follow his camo-clad gloves holding his rifle around a corner towards the mosque. We watch on as he approaches the first victim, a worshipper who greets him with a polite "hello, brother," just as, without warning, the man behind the camera raises his shotgun and opens fire, killing 4 people on the spot. He throws that shotgun to the ground and grabs his semi-automatic AR-15, killing 2 more men in the hallway near the entrance. He's attached a strobe light to the gun and it disorientates the victims. So in the main hall, which is packed with worshippers with nowhere to go, he would then mow down dozens of people where they knelt. He shoots at every person he sees, as well as into the side rooms as he passes. Worshippers can be seen scrambling for cover, trying to shield their loved ones, searching for exits as panic tears through the building. Amid the chaos, though, there are moments of extraordinary bravery. Naeem Rashid ran towards the attacker in a desperate attempt to stop him, an act of courage that would cost him his life and earn him a posthumous bravery award. Just 2 minutes into the attack, people start calling police. The gunman moves outside. He's still firing off rounds, but he's returned to his car to retrieve another gun. He then heads back through the mosque's southern gate, killing 2 people who've tried to hide behind the cars. He goes back inside the building, shooting dead those he'd previously wounded. After 6 harrowing minutes, the gunman returns to his car again, and this time he drives away, running over the body of a woman he'd killed as he fires shots out the window at worshippers running from the horror. Behind his fleeing vehicle is a scene of utter chaos. The cries of the wounded would mix in with the sounds of sirens as police finally arrive, not realising that the car holding the man they wanted to stop was leaving just as they pulled up, their view of him obscured by a passing bus. But the rampage doesn't end there. Speeding through Christchurch's streets at over 130 kilometres an hour, weaving through lanes and into oncoming traffic, the gunman makes his way to the Linwood Islamic Centre. Now, the live stream ends here, the connection to Facebook interrupted right before the attacker aims a shotgun at the driver of another vehicle, pulling the trigger twice, but it fails to fire both times. While the live stream has ended, the GoPro continues to record. So at 1:52 p.m, it captures the very moment he pulls into the driveway outside the Linwood building, where around 100 people are beginning their prayers. He blocks the entrance to the car park so no one can leave. He again steps out and opens fire, but unable to initially find the front door, he instead shoots those who are still outside and into the building through the windows. As he grabs yet another gun from his car, Abdul Aziz Wahabzada runs outside and throws a payment terminal at him in an attempt to stop the violence. The gunman fires back, but misses. Aziz picks up an empty shotgun that's been thrown to the ground and, taking cover amongst the nearby cars, he yells out his location, attempting to draw the man to him and away from the building. His valiant efforts, however, fail, and the armed man enters the centre, shooting and killing 3 more people. As he emerges from the building, Aziz confronts him again. The man pulls a bayonet from his vest, but instead of attacking Aziz, he returns to his car and just 4 minutes after his arrival, drives away. By this stage, police now have a description of the vehicle. The 2005 Subaru Outback was spotted by a police unit, which then rammed the vehicle off the road. Now, the man would later admit that he was actually on his way to his 3rd target, another mosque in Ashburton, southwest of Christchurch. In just 36 minutes, 51 people were killed. The oldest victim, 77, the youngest, just 3, as 89 others lay wounded in what would become New Zealand's darkest day, a moment of profound grief and loss witnessed not only by those who were there that day, but by the entire world. All of it live-streamed. 36 minutes of horror, much of it broadcast in real time with people watching across the globe. Now, some felt helpless as that violence unfolded, desperate but unable to intervene as innocent men, women and children fell to the gunman's bullets. But not all of them. I'm Claire Murphy, and this is True Crime Conversations, a podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. When the gunman arrived in court, he smiled at the collection of journalists sent to cover the case, making an inverted OK gesture with his hand, said to be a symbol for white supremacy. Over the course of his trial, where he was charged with 51 counts of murder, 40 of attempted murder, and engaging in a terrorist act, the psychiatric assessment would find he was of sound mind. He sent 7 letters during this time. One of them, addressed to Alan in Russia, ended up posted on both the 4chan and 8chan websites. The 6-page letter, written in pencil on a small notepad, mainly speaks of memories of his trip to Russia in 2015, thanking his supporter for the postage stamps he'd sent in order for him to be able to correspond with him. He admits he can't go into any detail about any regrets or feelings he has about his situation, as the guards would just confiscate the letter. But it ended with a statement that a great conflict was coming and used language that could be read as inciting his supporters to violence. He would, at one stage, dismiss his lawyers, deciding to represent himself and pleading guilty to all 92 charges. His sentencing was televised, the judge informing him that he would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, New Zealand's first ever terrorism conviction. Justice Cameron Mander told the gunman that his crimes were so wicked that even if he was detained until he died, it would not exhaust the requirements of punishment and denunciation. The gunman lodged an appeal against his conviction and sentencing in November 2022. But what really motivated this Australian man to move to New Zealand and commit this hate-filled crime? Is the story of a lone wolf, a solo operator who'd been radicalised online, a man who'd been so corrupted that his anger and violence finally spilled over into the real world, really true? As the host of the Secrets We Keep Lone Actor podcast, Joey Watson, found out, the Christchurch terrorist was far from being alone. What we didn't know as he took those guns and walked through those spaces held sacred by the Muslim community of Christchurch, he actually had hundreds of people with him. Joey joins us now to talk about what he found as he traced the movements of the Christchurch terrorist in the years before he ever stepped foot on New Zealand soil. Joey, thanks so much for joining us on True Crime Conversations today. Your podcast is like chasing a ghost through the internet, and it's really interesting to see what you uncover as you try and track the final years and months leading up to the Christchurch terror attack in 2019. I wanted to kick off with a question that you seem to struggle with yourself at the start of all of this, which is, and we up to this point haven't mentioned the name of the terrorist yet. And it's something that we have to question, because how much do you shine a light on someone who obviously wanted to be in the spotlight for this particular purpose, which is a mass shooting? But then how do you discuss the story without saying his name at the same time? How did you find that line between telling that story and glorifying the man who did this terrible thing?
In terms of naming him, I mean, I think it sort of asks an even broader question around, why this story was worth doing, and whether it was, and what decisions we made along the way to make sure at every stage we tried to do it as responsibly as possible, because you always run the risk of amplifying terrorism. When Christchurch happened, it was a day that brought home this threat of right-wing extremist terrorism in the most unimaginably tragic and horrible way. It happened in a part of the world that no one could have expected, by someone, a young Australian guy from regional New South Wales, who you would never have expected to have committed something like that. But very soon after, it sort of seemed to disappear from public view. I wanted to show to an Australian audience that there was actually a lot more going on here, and we can't just kind of conveniently explain it away as this lone, hate-filled loner. Soon after that, I sort of started speaking to members of the victim community, and the victim community I found also, even though of course there's a lot of diversity within the victim community, even within families, about how this should be remembered and how it should be contended with, but certainly that they also had a lot of, very important questions and felt that there were things missing in terms of understanding, how this attack had come to be. And so that was very much the spirit through which I engaged with this, the investigation. The questions that I wanted to answer were the questions of researchers that had been looking at this space for years, and then also questions that the victim community still had.
So Australia needs to stand up and kind of take responsibility for him too.
I think so. And also just sort of on a more kind of technical level, when I actually started writing the podcast, we did do versions of it where we tried not to name him, gave him sort of pseudonyms like The Individual or something like that. But it had what I kind of call a Voldemort effect, where it ended up being maybe giving it more power than it necessarily deserved. Ultimately, this podcast is not a biography of him. It's, he doesn't really have any agency in this story other than an archive of his posts that help to track out his radicalisation trajectory. He certainly doesn't have a voice. As far as I'm concerned, he's a complete and utter non-entity. And it's really about the worlds around him and how he interacted with those worlds, and how I feel like those worlds have some, at least philosophical, sociological culpability in terms of creating what happened on March 15, 2019.
I'd like you to take us back to 2014 first. So 2014, 2015, and I think it is easy for us to forget what the climate was like across those 2 years. And I mean politically across the world, what was happening. But it was also, there was a lot happening on the internet that maybe a lot of us weren't aware of at the time. Because we might have been in the world of Facebook, but there was all these communities existing on websites like 4chan and 8chan. And these do play quite a big role in creating what would become the Christchurch terror attack in 2019. So can you give us an idea, first of all, what the Chans are and how they played a role, and I'm going to name him, a role in Brenton Tarrant's world back then?
So the Chans were something that went all the way back to the early parts of the internet. They're what's called an image board website. It was adopted from a Japanese model. The first one in the English-speaking part of the world was called 4chan, and that started in 2004. Tarrant's mum had said that he'd been on the sites, since he was 10, which really would put him right there at the beginning of the site, beginning in the English-speaking parts of the world. At its heart, basically, it's just a place to share pictures, memes, texts, particularly on topics like gaming, anime, stuff like that. Things that were particularly of interest to this subculture of young teenage boys and young men at this point in time. But there was one thing about 4chan that made it particularly interesting, which is that users did not have to share their identity. So a lot of the interactions are done completely anonymously. It's a kind of space of uninhibited anonymity, which in the early years actually gave it a great sense of creativity. So a lot of the memes that we see on the internet today actually come from those early days of 4chan. But then there were things happening around 4chan, and there was a kind of group of websites, but one that became particularly important and particularly dark was a sort of web forum called Iron March, which was extraordinarily terroristic and became more and more terroristic in the years leading up to Christchurch. And they were like actively targeting 4chan, recruiting members from 4chan, particularly from that 2014-2015 window. And, you know, strategically, sort of the closer I looked at their propaganda is that you know, they were finding ways to share material, share propaganda that would really create, you know, one-man army, lone actor terrorism. And, you know, while it doesn't make Christchurch look inevitable, it certainly makes it look extremely explainable, especially when you see how wildly close the lining up between those particular activities happening on 4chan and then Tarrant's radicalisation trajectory actually are.
That's what's happening around 4chan and the internet, but in the real world too, there are things happening which is pushing these young men to become more radicalised. And, you know, there was incidents in 2014 in Sydney. You know, there was, you know, a lot happening out in the real world that was also pushing this really anti-Muslim agenda.
Absolutely. And I think like the three things really that were happening, creating this perfect storm at this period of time, were the migrant crisis in Europe became a mobilizing issue for many people. It was being preyed upon by far-right actors to make it look like, you know, Europe was in crisis, that traditional European ways of life were being challenged. That coincided with the rise of Islamic State. And that led to a spate of terror, you know, seemingly interconnected terror incidents in the West. And at the same time, we had this critical mass forming on, you know, mainstream social media, places like Facebook. And so this is a kind of a whole separate ecosystem that I think Tarrant was very, very much part of as well, which is like in Australia, far-right extremist groups. So, for example, the biggest one at the time was the United Patriots Front, which seemed to have come from nowhere, but was preying on these things for propaganda. You know, a young guy who became a mainstay of the Australian far right called Blair Cottrell started showing up at these big anti-mosque protests in Bendigo and basically taking over the movement. But really what we see is that these guys were using these, you know, Islamophobia as a tool for recruitment, as a mobilizing tool. In truth, they were Hitler-worshipping, race war wanting hardcore extremists, but it became a tool to sort of hoover all these people up, bring them into the movement, and then to radicalize them more and more and more towards violence. And over the years after that, in the lead up to Christchurch, we get this whole archive of posts that researchers had collected showing Tarrant engaging with groups like the United Patriots Front and its successor, the Lad Society, as well, in very serious ways, sort of defending its leaders to people that were threatening them, encouraging its growth, sharing thoughts on strategy, and then eventually, as we get closer to the attack, also forecasting the violence that he was going to commit to a very an audience that was very willing to listen.
Can you give us an idea of some of the things that Tarrant was saying in some of his posts, because at some stage he's flipped from this conversations that he's having with people because he wants to travel. He's come into a bit of money, so he wants to go to China and he's getting some references and it all seems very innocent, to say within that radicalisation window that you discussed, 2014 to 2015, the conversations he's having have changed dramatically. What kinds of things is he talking about? Yeah,
so we have a pretty sizable archive of posts from across the years, and they come from everywhere from like Lonely Planet blogs, which like a travel blog that doesn't really exist anymore. He was posting on websites where you ask for stock advice on how to invest in the stock market, cryptocurrency websites, and then, of course, 4chan. And then we have the posts I just mentioned in the Australian extremist circles. And we can kind of see this process from where in the years 2011, 2012, 2013, he looks like a kind of fairly normal, likable guy. And that's consistent with the people that I spoke to that knew him from that period. I mean, he could be a bit of a menace, it was known to be. He had experienced bullying at school and also a lot of trauma in his personal life, which maybe we can talk about a bit later. Those are the push factors as opposed to the pull factors of radicalization, which also play a role, of course. But yeah, he's talking about wanting to travel for the rest of his life. He's asking for advice on his itinerary. The posts, in many ways, from my read, seem kind of like full of hope, not necessarily any sign of darkness or right-wing terrorism or anything that it would soon develop into. And then it's crazy how quickly it happens. We have from 2014, the middle of 2014, he's asking advice for an itinerary for an upcoming trip that he would take to the interior of China. Amazing jam-packed itinerary. And then by the middle of 2015, he starts to talk about things like race wars. He says comments like, violence is the last resort of a cornered animal. An important moment that he was responding to in those early race war posts was a shooting at a black church in Charleston. A young guy had killed 9 worshippers who were in prayer in Charleston. He had, it then turned out, had been posting on a website called The Daily Stormer, which was one of these websites around 4chan that was kind of radicalizing 4chaners. Tarrant had donated numerous times to that website using cryptocurrency. And sort of he's defending Dylan Roof. Soon after that, he's posting pictures of white mass shooters and venerating them. And then it seems to just kind of get darker and darker. He starts to talk more about race wars. He starts to talk about this fascist fantasy of the day of the rope by 2015 and 2016. This is a day where everyone who isn't in for the cause of hardcore racism are basically executed, and it's become a big part of neo-Nazi and far-right fantasy. And then by 2017 and 2018, we can actually see him kind of directly forecasting the violence that he's planning. You know, he says, for example, that he's by this stage moved to Dunedin in New Zealand, and he's talking about going to a gym and seeing an Islamic school across the road from his gym, and how that would be convenient because it would mean that the people would all be gathering in one place. And, you know, people are supporting that idea. There's certainly no one's calling him out for it. And then later on, you know, as we get closer in 2018 on 4chan, he's talking about, you know, the mosques that he's going to attack. He's outlining where the mosques are in Christchurch. He mentions the third mosque in Ashburton, which is where he was on his way to before he was veered off the road by police on the day of the attack. And yeah, to an audience that is broadly supportive. And by looking at sort of the relationship between his posts and the people around him, you kind of get the sense of a communal radicalization where people are desensitizing each other together. And then the sort of ultimate post, the final post, actually happens on the day of the attack, where he posts his manifesto and a link to the live stream on a website called 8chan, which had become an offshoot of 4chan, which was somehow even more unhinged by this stage. And he asks people to do their part in sharing his propaganda, and they absolutely do. The video, the live stream had been re-uploaded thousands and thousands of times. I think YouTube recorded a new upload every second that had to be taken down for 24 hours after the attack. The manifesto was translated into multiple languages. This was a community. This was a community from which Christchurch grew.
Can we talk about that community? Because this is something that I really found interesting in your investigation, was this ideology that seems to come from a man called James Mason, who wrote the book Siege, which is this idea that the organised far-right groups were failing in their targets. And so there was this idea that instead it would take individuals to do big gestures like the Christchurch incident in order for them to really start winning this race war. And so, yes, there are communities out there, and there does seem to be some leaders amongst these communities too. But in essence, they are, and this is mentioned in the podcast, they are centralized, but they are decentralized in the fact that they are not part of any particular group or movement. There's not one person in charge of giving directives. They might be saying things that are encouraging people to take their own actions. But what's really difficult is that these are not organized like political parties that you can hold accountable for the things that its members does. There's this idea that it should be an individual response to these situations.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to one of the difficulties in defining, what a terror organization is and what a terror organization actually looks like in the 21st century, which is very different to what an original conception might be. James Mason was a neo-Nazi, a lifelong neo-Nazi, going all the way back to American Nazi movements like George Lincoln Rockwell, this kind of famous cigar-smoking guy who'd resurrected Hitlerist ideas in the US in the 60s after they'd been taboo for 20 years after the war. And by the 80s, he'd become extremely disillusioned with how the fascist movements in the US were operating. Neo-Nazi movements are extremely liable to be split. So often leaders are assassinated by other members. 9 times out of 10 when a neo-Nazi leader dies, it's usually at the hands of someone within their own movement. And so in the 80s, he started to publish a series of newsletters called Siege, where he outlined this alternative vision, which is that, rather than trying to organize cells that are so liable to be infiltrated and split, we should actually just have one-man armies. People should go out and plan and carry out terrorism by themselves. When he eventually published that into a book into the early 90s, and he had a bit of a splash, but it didn't really go anywhere. And partly that was because he ended up in prison for abusing an ex-partner of his who was a teenage girl. He was a man in his late 40s at this stage. But then also because it faced some structural barriers. So in the 90s, neo-Nazis relied on groups to radicalize new members, to bring people into the movement, to spread their vision, to be organized. There was no technology available to be able to do it any other way. But Mason at the time didn't predict the power of the internet. And what we see is after sort of 20 years of obscurity, when these forums around 8chan that I'd mentioned, that one Iron March that I think plays a particularly important role in the podcast, people in these forums, start to resurrect James Mason's ideas. I mean, Iron March had become a place where a whole bunch of different kind of hectic fascist literature had been discussed and explored. There's a whole bunch of groups that are formed on Iron March that at the time we had no idea were interconnected. We didn't know until after there was a big leak actually after Christchurch in November 2019 of all of Iron March's messages and data going back years, pretty much since the beginning of the site. It's now often referred to as the Skull Mask Network. And when you look at how, something like James Mason was being reignited in this period, it's like, wow, okay, well, Christchurch is in so many ways explainable by James Mason and his theories, and scattered throughout the manifesto of the Christchurch terrorists. And the manifesto is a kind of complicated document with lots of different references to lots of different subcultures, but unquestionably lines that are directly inspired by James Mason and Siege. James Mason believed that if you had enough Christchurch-style terrorist attacks carried out, in a short period of time, you'd trigger a reaction, an oppositional reaction, a violent reaction. It would lead to some kind of war along racial lines, and then eventually a race war, and then society would collapse, and from that, a utopian whites-only society would be built. I mean, it's like totally airy-fairy, pseudo-religious insanity, but it was deeply held by a lot of people all around the world in the lead up to Christchurch, and I think unquestionably also by the Christchurch terrorist himself.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Claire Murphy. I'm speaking with investigative journalist and host of Secrets We Keep, lone actor Joey Watson. Up next, Joey tells us what he discovered when he was tracking Brenton Tarrant in the years leading up to his attack on the mosques in Christchurch. Well, you were tracking Tarrant not only on the internet but in the real world too in those years leading up to 2019. And we know that he did quite a lot of travel. I mean, we knew that beforehand anyway because he was asking for, reviews on things and posting his itineraries. But through 2016 to 2018, he was traveling to sort of a certain area of Europe frequently. Do we know for sure what he was doing during those trips?
I think that we have elements where I feel like I have a clearer picture of what was going on at that point, at these points in time. So Tarrant had become, by the day of the attack, obsessed with an area of Europe known as the Balkans. The Balkans is a place where people have in very recent history killed for race and religion. People might be familiar with or remember the Balkan Wars of the 90s, after the fall of Yugoslavia, the Bosnian, which primarily took place in Bosnia, where Christian Serbian forces and Croatian Catholic forces targeted, in many ways, Bosniak Muslims and eventually committed the only genocide in Europe since the Second World War at Srebrenica. And it's very much an area of Europe where things are still completely kind of divided along racial lines. And in Serbia in particular, a lot of the people that carried out those attacks were celebrated. When Christchurch happened, Tarrant had played a song venerating the perpetrator of the man who would sort of who was now in prison for carrying out that genocide or being responsible for that genocide at Srebrenica, Radovan Karadzic. He also painted the names of Serb war leaders on his guns in Cyrillic, the traditional alphabet of Serbia and Eastern Europe. So the fact that he had been there, on there's two separate trips here, but the fact that he'd been in Serbia and Bosnia in 2016 became kind of a focus point for this investigation. And interestingly enough, while it was very difficult to retrace exactly what he was doing at that point in time, Serbian authorities were not particularly forthcoming. This is where he'd actually emailed the rifle club. So this is about 2 years before the attack. This is where he'd emailed the rifle club in New Zealand, asking if they were taking members, which was his first step in his mobilization towards violence. It was unclear how closely that was linked to the setting in which it took place until last year. Researchers at Auckland University unearthed a whole bunch of new 4chan posts. They were made anonymously, but they are, with a high degree of certainty, were made by the terrorist, where he is actually sort of talking about being in the Balkans, claiming that he was committing acts of violence while he was there against Muslims, for example, at a bar in Croatia. And then he talks about wanting the reignition of the Balkan Wars and that the reignition of another genocide, and that he would be willing to fund 4chan users if they sort of post a picture of themselves being able to fire a weapon to come to the Balkans to help carry out that genocide. And people are kind of largely very receptive to it. He's very specific in his claims as well. He says, he has a investment property which he would sell to be able to carry it out. That's true. He did have an investment property that he had with his sister. So the level of specificity is kind of like deeply concerning and very confronting. And those are some of the most confronting posts from the whole investigation. There is a second Balkan trip then, again, which happens just months before the attack. And this time he goes to Bulgaria. He does this sort of like ultra-nationalist pilgrimage. So Bulgaria is a country right in the southeast corner of Europe. It shares a border with Turkey, and for a great deal of its history, it had been occupied by the Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim empire. And the Christian Bulgaria's kind of wars of resistance against the Ottomans are a huge part of nationalist mythology, and scattered throughout the Balkan Mountains in Bulgaria are all these locations celebrating those wars. And Tarrant had left behind an archive of Facebook photos that sort of show that he had visited a whole bunch of these places, and I followed in his footsteps. And in Bulgaria, while I don't want to sort of be that journalist that just goes to another country and starts, judging its politics in any way, but in terms of having explanatory power for this story, it's I've never seen so many kind of swastikas in my life. It's a country where a lot of extremist groups in Western Europe do activities there because they feel like they can get away with more there. The institutions are weaker compared to the rest of Europe, but all of their propaganda, interestingly, was in English, and I found out that they were regularly being visited by far-right extremists from Western Europe, for example. And yeah, there's certainly a theory that this would have been the reason of why Tarrant had become so obsessed with this part of the world, and maybe that he'd even been in contact with these groups in the years leading up to the attack. It certainly shows kind of just how much more there was going on, and things like Bulgaria, which at first seemed so random and obscure, started to make a lot more sense.
There is records of Tarrant donating to various far-right figures. One of those is Austrian Martin Zelnner, who he and his girlfriend together do a lot of work in this far-right space. They have podcasts. They do a lot of discussions with people around their belief systems, and you couldn't prove that they actually met in person whilst he was in Europe. But he would then become, I believe, the only person to be investigated in relation to the shooting in Christchurch outside of the New Zealand investigation, because of his potential links to Tarrant and potentially to be motivating him to do what he did. How much do we know about the relationship between those two and just how close were they, and could he have influenced Tarrant to do what he did?
Yeah, so Martin Zelnner is the leader of probably the most prominent member of an organization called the Identitarian Movement, which it began in France around 2010 and 2011, but had slowly spread to Europe, in 2017 and 2018, and then became the title of Tarrant's manifesto, right? So because of and Tarrant was certainly throughout the manifesto obsessed with this theory, and that he propagated it in himself. This meant that immediately after there was heaps of commentary in the media about these crazy similarities between the ideology of Martin Zelnner and the ideology of the Christchurch terrorist, and people wondered whether there were any links. Very soon after that, it became apparent that Tarrant had donated a fairly large donation of about $1,500 to Martin Zelnner. He then came under investigation. In the course of that investigation, it was revealed, he'd originally sort of said that that was the extent of it and maybe that they'd exchanged an email. But in the course of that investigation, it came out that they'd actually had quite a comprehensive email exchange, that Tarrant had been invited by Zelnner to come and meet him for a coffee or a beer if he was ever in Vienna. And after the day after the last email had been exchanged between the two, Tarrant had actually booked a hire car for a trip to Vienna that he would take after Bulgaria. So we're really talking, just months, really, really, weeks even before the attack, right at the end of 2018. I think it's sort of November 2018. Zelnner obviously emphatically denies ever having met with Tarrant. I don't know whether during that trip Zelnner and Tarrant actually met. The record of Tarrant's time in Austria is extremely limited. I noticed the way New Zealand investigators talk about it in their report. They're kind of inconclusive. They say it's unlikely that he would have met with Zelnner because he wouldn't have, quote, wanted to draw security attention to himself so close to the attack. That may well be true.
Well, let's talk about the month or two he spends in New Zealand before the day he decides to live stream the attack on those mosques. What was he doing in that time? We know that he has reached out to the rifle club. We know that he has learnt to shoot through a gamer friend of his who's gone shooting together. So we know that he's kind of prepping himself at this stage. But what do we know about what he's doing and saying online? Is he making it very clear that he is about to do what he's going to do?
I think that unquestionably he's forecasting the violence that he's about to plan. I mean, we had this period leading up to the attack where his real life world is unquestionably extremely alone, but his online world seems to be quite engaged and grown.
Because his apartment is bare, right? He's barely got any furniture in his apartment. He's living a very scant life.
It's extremely scant. And I mean, so the move to New Zealand, originally was one of those things that seemed kind of just random, especially because it was to Dunedin. I mean, maybe if he'd gone to Auckland, it would have made more sense, but he had no family connections in Dunedin, But now that we know that his radicalisation trajectory and that he'd already been resolving towards violence for years before that, it starts to look more like a strategic decision, right? This was something that he would do because he knew that he would have more lenient gun laws there. He had a friend that he'd met gaming in Waikato at the other end of the country that assisted him in getting his gun license. He became his referee, and the father of this gaming friend became Tarrant's second referee. And this was within weeks of him arriving in New Zealand. He'd already applied for his gun license. He then regularly trained. He went to the gym. He didn't have much of an online he didn't have much of a real world social life whatsoever. As you said, there was not much, even furniture in his apartment, but there was a computer. And so much of the social engagement that we see in that period leading up to the attack, that's where that happened, including that forecasting of violence. So the main events that we have in Tarrant's life are things like, at one stage, he, at the end of 2017, he injures himself when he's cleaning his rifle, and he has to present to hospital to get his eye fixed because of injuries that he'd sustained in that moment in time. He also has to go to hospital another period for steroid use. He'd been abusing steroids, it seemed, and that was his second presentation. These are the nature of his social interaction. They all seem to revolve around something to do with the attack. In January, on I think the 12th of January, he'd taken a trip to Christchurch where he'd conducted surveillance of the mosque. He'd flown a drone over the mosque to sort of work out how he was going to carry out the attack. And otherwise, he was just sort of meticulously training. I mean, he was, in many ways, the ultimate realization of what James Mason had predicted and asked for, and what these groups were calling for of a one-man army. This was, coordinated lone actor terrorism.
Then he makes a phone call the night before the attack, calls his mum, and she says that phone call wasn't quite right.
Yeah, that's right. His mum had told Australian investigators that he'd said that he loved her, which is not something he said very often. And, I try in this sort of investigation to focus on the world around Tarrant and not him so much specifically. But, certainly there is a kind of element of like deep, dark tragedy in that moment in time. Because, then the next day he goes and sort of carries out the unimaginable that had been a consequence of worlds that his mum certainly wouldn't have known about or understood, worlds that most Australians certainly wouldn't have known about or understood. And I think that's why we kind of came to see him as being completely alone, because they were so invisible to everyone else around him.
Next, I asked Joey about the manifesto that Tarrant published online on the day of the attack and the dangerous repercussions of it being made available to the internet. As you mentioned, he published his manifesto online on the day of the attack. He also emailed it to then Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's office. We kind of understand what the manifesto included, but where does that exist now? Once you put something on the internet, it's generally there forever. And as you mentioned, it was translated into a bunch of different languages. It was shared far and wide across the world. Can you ever remove something like that from the internet?
Yeah, I think it's important to say as well that he had been not only strategic in the way that he committed the violence, but I'd argue even more strategic in the way that he created his propaganda in order for this to become an inspirational act of terrorism, right? He'd live streamed the attack. He'd created a manifesto that was deliberately targeted to the multiple communities that he was operating in, things that made him look kind of insane to people that were outside those communities, that made kind of complete sense to people that were on 8chan. It was full of in-jokes, and then, of course, references to some of the darker stuff like the James Mason stuff that we had spoken about. But, through the live stream, which he knew would be proliferated through the internet by 8chaners, and people on the other extremist forums around 8chan, he knew that it would be shared thousands and thousands of times. He'd done that thing of, that thing that inspirational terrorists try to do, which is to create terrorism that looks like theatre, that's something that can be consumed. Not so different to the spectacle of having planes fly into the World Trade Center. It's not just about the damage that's inflicted on the people that are in the towers, and it's not just about, the 51 dead and all of the injured, including, children as young as 3 and 4 that are shot on that day in the mosques. It's also, about creating the spectacle, the inspirational spectacle for people to consume it, and to, hopefully, or his hope is that they would then kind of carry it on. And that is certainly absolutely what we've seen. It's interesting that Australia sort of had this collective amnesia around the event, as we sort of tried to forget that it had ever happened. People in this community became, obsessed with it. Very soon after, there was a shift away from some of these forums onto a new space called Telegram. I think Christchurch was really important in that, because, it was clear that they weren't going to be tenable for much longer, and they were right. For example, 8chan, the company Cloudflare that provided the web infrastructure for it stopped doing that by August that year. And so a lot of these people moved to a different messaging platform called Telegram, which is owned by this Russian tech billionaire, Pavel Durov, who supposedly has fathered 200 kids around the world. He's like a pro-natalist guy. And he'd set up Telegram deliberately to be unsubpoenable. Like it's a shell companies within shell companies. It's registered in the British Virgin Islands and Dubai. And within those websites, a new network kind of formed called Telegram that was very much relied on what happened in Christchurch as a core part of its propaganda. So they created, for example, a pantheon of saints. This is something that Islamic extremists had that white extremists had not yet had, which was a culture of martyrdom. Tarrant was seen very much, along with Anders Breivik, for the Oslo terrorist, as the original saint in the pantheon, and it encouraged other users to carry out similar acts in order to be added to this pantheon, to be venerated and respected by this community. And that absolutely happened. So it's wild how Tarrant was both a kind of a product of the propaganda in these communities, but then he also became propaganda in himself.
The whole purpose of your podcast is to show that whilst we see Tarrant as a lone terrorist, as someone who did this purely off their own back, that in reality he had hundreds, if not thousands, of people with him that day. There were those who had that link and watched that live stream. There were those who had helped radicalise him, who had even down to showing him how to modify the weapons that he used on that day. Do we then presume that when we see any other reports of lone terror attacks or lone gunmen or someone who acts seemingly off their own back, that potentially there's always a community of thousands involved in that person planning, creating, training, and then taking actual action in the real world?
I don't think so. I think there definitely are there definitely are instances where violence is truly sort of committed on a lone actor level, right? So, for example, I would say it would be difficult to pin the Bondi Junction stabbing to any sort of larger ideology. In the same way, I think the Port Arthur massacre, right? This was a guy that had a long history of being psychologically disturbed. He wasn't connected to any broader ecosystem. But I think what we're talking about is a specific subsection of mass shooters, which is far-right terrorism. And I think in those cases, it's becoming increasingly clear that they are borrowing from a deeper ideology. And it's always an extremely difficult thing to know, in the black box of the human mind, where the ideology begins and where the proclivity to violence, or what researchers would call the push factors towards extremism begin. But I think in this case specifically, and indeed I think in definitely in other cases, the explanatory value of those communities, it's pretty much undeniable. But yeah, it's really difficult, and it's becoming more. And I think it's becoming more and more difficult. Like going back to that Telegram designation last week, right? Like we used to have a clear kind of sense of what a terrorist organization looked like. And in the period leading up to Christchurch, it kind of starts to break down. I mean, we mentioned how one of the former members of Adam Waffen told me how the group was centralized but also decentralized. So they did have something that looked like that. Like they did train together. They did create propaganda strategically. They did kind of organize a little bit across state lines in the US and a little bit in Australia. But also the purpose of the group was to go beyond the group. It was really to inspire people to go, to use their language, guns a-blazing, even if that meant on the other side of the world. And then now it's become sort of even more amorphous, where you have a thing like Telegram. All it really is like a bunch of chats. Like it really is like a bunch of chats that you can kind of access on your smartphone. It has no discernible leadership structure. I mean, there have been some people that have arrested for particular incitements to violence, but it doesn't have any discernible leadership structure. It's not even clear, what is a specific Telegram chat and what isn't. And now we're saying, that in Australia, people could be charged for up to 25 years in jail for being a member of Telegram. But, I wonder, and it really is interesting that it happened last week because it speaks to the kind of complexity of this lone actor thing. It's like, well, what does it mean to be a member of Telegram? I mean, there are a bunch of chats, on your smartphone. So, and
there's a bunch of researchers and journalists and all kinds of people who are checking in on this stuff.
Sure. Yeah, we hope. I mean, that's why. Yeah, and I guess that goes back to your question before. It's like, as a researcher, I do infiltrate these spaces. I do have pseudonyms that I use on these sites, and it is alarming how kind of easy it is still now to be able to access sort of terror-related material, just like right now. I could do it right now while I was sitting across from you. So yeah, it's a really difficult environment, and I don't envy the role that intelligence agencies need to play in trying to monitor this space. It certainly is not nothing like what it used to be.
I think many of us are familiar with what happened on that day in 2019. I mean, some people have even seen it, having seen the live stream. I've never actually looked at it. We know that more than 50 people died that day, and potentially could have been more. As you mentioned, he was intercepted potentially on his way to a third mosque when he was run off the road by police. But do you think a lot of lessons were learned after that day? I mean, it definitely rocked New Zealand to its core because it was so unexpected. And they weren't aware, Tarrant having potentially taken advantage of their lax gun laws compared to Australia, for example. So there was a Royal Commission, there were changes to gun laws. Do you think the things that happened in the wake of that Christchurch attack have gone any ways to potentially stopping it from happening again?
I really hope so. I worry about the fact that Australia had distanced itself so much from the attack, and the fact that it happened in New Zealand meant that New Zealand agencies really had to bear the brunt of responsibility for the attack. And so much of the analysis that's publicly available is about their role, what they had missed, where really, New Zealand was the setting, but actually had very, very little to do with what happened in Christchurch.
They were just the last destination.
They were the last destination. And gun laws are an exception to that. And Jacinda Ardern, sort of like John Howard had after Port Arthur, passed gun law reform to make it more difficult to access things like semi-automatic weapons in New Zealand. And those, apparently are being contested in New Zealand Parliament now. And there are people who as there often are with gun legislation, it has become, within the realm of controversial, unfortunately. But in Australia, I don't know, there wasn't much of a response, both socially and culturally, as we said, but also institutionally. I mean, we never had an inquiry here as to what had led him to violence. I mean, it's a societal wide problem, and something that I think will need to be addressed. And while I sincerely hope that something like Christchurch would never happen again, I think there's a lot of feeling within the community that. Within the research community specifically, that Christchurch might not necessarily be the last time something like this happens, and I just hope that we're in a position to be able to stop it before it does.
Thank you to Joey for helping us tell this story today. There's a link to his podcast, Lone Actor, in the show notes. True Crime Conversations is a podcast hosted by me, Claire Murphy, and produced by Tali Blackman, with audio design by Jacob Round. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.